It all started with a gnome. Not just any gnome, mind you. This was Norman, my trusty garden gnome, a friendly little fellow with a pointy red hat and a cheerful grin. He stood proudly in my flower bed, a beacon of whimsy in a world of suburban conformity. But the HOA, those guardians of good taste and enemies of fun, didn't see it that way. They saw Norman as a threat, an excessive decorative item that dared to disrupt the aesthetic harmony of our meticulously manicured neighborhood. The violation notice arrived on a Tuesday, tucked neatly amongst the bills and junk mail. "Excessive decorative items are not permitted," it declared in bold, bureaucratic font. "Remove the aforementioned gnome or face a fine," I scoffed. "Excessive?" I muttered to myself. Have they seen Mrs. Henderson's giant metal rooster or Mr. Johnson's dolphin fountain that looks like it's about to launch into orbit? And don't even get me started on the pink flamingo army that had taken over Mrs. Higgins's lawn. Yet somehow, my little Norman was the problem. I marched down to the HOA office, ready to fight for my gnome's right to exist. But Karen, the HOA president, with her perfectly coiffed hair and her condescending smile, was unmoved. "Rules are rules," she declared, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "And your gnome, I'm afraid, is in violation." "But what about the rooster?" I protested. "And the flamingos? And the dolphin fountain that looks like it's about to give birth to a smaller, equally terrifying dolphin?" Karen's smile widened. "Those," she said, "are different. They're unique. Your gnome, on the other hand, is simply excessive." I stared at her, speechless. The hypocrisy was astounding. The HOA, those self-proclaimed guardians of good taste, were clearly playing favorites, and I, the owner of a perfectly harmless lawn gnome, was their latest victim. That's when I decided to fight back. Not with angry letters or petty complaints, but with a gnome so big, so ridiculously oversized, that it would make their heads spin. "If they think Norman is excessive," I muttered to myself, a mischievous grin spreading across my face, "then I'll give them excessive. I'll give them a gnome they'll never forget." And so my plan was hatched. A plan that would involve a crane, a whole lot of fiberglass, and a healthy dose of good old-fashioned gnome-tastic revenge. If the HOA thought Norman was excessive, I'd show them what excessive really meant. My plan? To erect a gnome so monumental, so ridiculously oversized, that it would make their precious rule book spontaneously combust. I'm talking about a 12-foot gnome, a behemoth of a garden guardian, a titan of terracotta, well, you get the picture. I found a company online that specialized in custom-made fiberglass statues. "Think you can handle a gnome?" I asked the sales rep, my voice barely containing my glee. "A gnome?" she chuckled. "Sure, we do gnomes all the time. How big are we talking?" 12 feet, I replied casually. Silence. 12 feet? She repeated, her voice a mix of disbelief and awe. "Yep," I confirmed. "And I want it to have a giant red hat, a smug grin, and LED eyes that glow at night." More silence. Then a burst of laughter. "You're kidding, right?" "Nope," I said, my grin widening. "This is serious gnome business." The sales rep, clearly intrigued by my project, and probably my sanity, agreed to take on the challenge. A few weeks later, a flatbed truck arrived, carrying my masterpiece. It was even more glorious than I had imagined. The gnome towered over my house, its red hat visible from blocks away. Its grin was wide and smug, its eyes glowing with an eerie green light. It was magnificent. But I wasn't taking any chances. I knew the HOA would try to find some loophole, some obscure rule to thwart my plan. So I built a flower bed around the gnome's base, carefully arranging flowers and shrubs to create a decorative garden feature. Technically, I explained to my neighbor, Mr. Henderson, who was watching the spectacle with a mixture of amusement and concern, it's not a statue, it's landscaping. Mr. Henderson, bless his timid heart, just nodded and mumbled something about creative interpretation. With the gnome in place and the flower bed loophole secured, it was time for the grand unveiling. I printed flyers, inviting the entire neighborhood to witness the unveiling of my garden art. I even baked a gnome-shaped cake, because why not? The day of the ceremony, my front yard was packed. Neighbors, curious onlookers, and even a few local news reporters gathered to witness the spectacle. I stood proudly beside my giant gnome, a pair of oversized scissors in hand, ready to cut the ribbon. "Welcome, everyone," I announced, my voice booming across the crowd. "Today we celebrate the arrival of Norman the Great." The crowd erupted in cheers. The ribbon was cut, the cake was devoured, and Norman, in all his 12-foot glory, became the talk of the town. And then Karen arrived. The unveiling ceremony was a sight to behold. I'd gone all out, setting up a makeshift stage in my front yard, complete with a red velvet curtain and a microphone that probably hadn't been used since the 80s. There were refreshments, lemonade, cookies, gnome-shaped, of course, and even a few bottles of sparkling cider for the adults who were feeling particularly festive. The neighborhood turned out in force. Kids were bouncing off the walls with excitement, parents were snapping photos, and even Mr. Henderson, the timid HOA president, was there, clutching a plate of cookies and looking slightly overwhelmed by the whole affair. "Welcome, neighbors," I announced into the microphone, my voice booming across the crowd. "Today we celebrate the arrival of Norman the Great." I gestured towards the giant gnome, still hidden behind the red velvet curtain. The crowd held their breath in anticipation. "But first," I continued, a mischievous glint in my eye, "a few words from our esteemed HOA president, Karen McDictator." The crowd gasped. Karen, who had been lurking at the edge of the crowd, her face a mask of disapproval, froze. She clearly hadn't expected to be called out like this. "Karen," I said, my voice dripping with mock sincerity, "would you do us the honor of cutting the ribbon?" Karen, her face now a rather alarming shade of purple, sputtered and stammered. But the crowd, sensing her discomfort, began to chant, "Karen, Karen, Karen!" She had no choice. With a forced smile and a trembling hand, she stepped forward and cut the ribbon. The crowd roared, and the curtain rose, revealing Norman in all his 12-foot glory. The cheers were deafening. Kids rushed forward to touch the gnome's giant boots, adults snapped photos, and even Mr. Henderson couldn't help but crack a smile. Karen, however, was not amused. Her eyes widened in horror, her jaw dropped, and a strangled gasp escaped her lips. She looked like she was about to faint. What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, her voice barely audible above the cheers. "It's a gnome, Karen," I replied calmly. "A decorative garden feature, perfectly within HOA regulations." Karen sputtered, her face contorting in a mask of fury. This is an abomination," she shrieked. It's excessive." "Excessive?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "But, Karen, you were the one who said my little Norman was excessive. So I decided to give you excessive. Excessive in all its 12-foot glory." Karen's eye twitched. She opened her mouth to retort, but no words came out. She just stood there, speechless, defeated by the sheer audacity of my gnome-tastic revenge. The party continued, the laughter and music drowning out Karen's sputtering rage. Norman, the giant gnome, had become a symbol of defiance, a monument to the absurdity of the HOA's rules. And Karen, the once invincible queen of the neighborhood, was now a laughingstock. Karen, still reeling from the shock of the giant gnome, sputtered and fumed like a malfunctioning sprinkler. This monstrosity, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Norman. It's an affront to nature. It's a blight on our community. It's a gnome invasion. I, ever the picture of calm and reason, simply smiled and held up my hands. Now, Karen, I said, my voice soothing and condescending, let's not get carried away. It's just a gnome. A rather large gnome, granted, but a gnome nonetheless. Just a gnome? Karen's voice reached a new octave. It's 12 feet tall. It's blocking out the sun. It's terrifying. Terrifying? I chuckled. Karen, have you seen the clown statue in Mrs. Henderson's garden? That thing could give a grown man nightmares. Karen sputtered, her face turning an even deeper shade of purple. That's different, she stammered. This gnome, it's excessive. Excessive? I echoed, pulling out the HOA rulebook, a thick binder filled with ridiculously specific regulations. Show me where it says anything about gnome height limits, Karen. I'll wait. Karen snatched the rulebook, her eyes scanning the pages with frantic intensity. She flipped through sections on fence heights, mailbox placement, and acceptable shades of beige. But nowhere could she find a single mention of gnome size restrictions. See, Karen? I said, my voice laced with a hint of triumph. Your outrage is based on nothing but your own arbitrary sense of aesthetics. You don't like my gnome? Tough luck. It's staying. Karen's shoulders slumped. She looked at the rulebook, then at the giant gnome, then back at the rulebook, her face a picture of defeat. She had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and out-gnomed. This isn't over, she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. I'll find a way, I always do. But I knew she wouldn't. The HOA, with their ridiculous rules and their hypocritical enforcement, had finally met their match. And Norman, the giant gnome, stood tall, a symbol of defiance against their petty tyranny. The HOA might have been fuming, but the rest of the neighborhood? They were loving it. Norman, the giant gnome, became an instant celebrity. Kids were posing for selfies with him. Dogs were barking greetings, or maybe warnings, and even old Mr. Henderson was caught sneaking a peek from his window with a hint of a smile. It was like Norman had sparked a gnome revolution. People who hadn't even considered lawn ornaments before were suddenly digging through garden centers, searching for their own little, or not-so-little, gnomes to add to the fun. Mrs. Higgins even replaced her flamingo army with a battalion of gnomes, each one painted a different vibrant color. "Take that, Karen," she declared, her voice echoing down the street. "If we can't have flamingos, we'll have gnomes." And then, the media arrived. A local news station, always eager for a quirky story, caught wind of the Great Gnome Standoff. They sent a reporter and a camera crew to my house, ready to document the HOA's latest absurdity. "So, tell me, Mr. Lucas," the reporter asked, her microphone practically touching my nose, "what inspired you to erect this monumental gnome?" "Well," I replied, gesturing towards Karen's house, "let's just say I have a unique relationship with our HOA president." The reporter chuckled. "I see. And what do the neighbors think?" "They love it," I said, gesturing towards the kids playing tag around Norman's giant boots. "He's become a local celebrity." The news segment aired that evening, complete with dramatic close-ups of Norman's smug grin and interviews with bewildered HOA members. The story went viral, turning my gnome into a national sensation. People were sharing memes, writing articles, and even creating fan art of Norman the Great. The HOA, of course, was mortified. Their attempt to enforce conformity had backfired spectacularly, turning my gnome into a symbol of defiance and a source of endless amusement. And Karen, the once feared HOA president, was now the butt of every joke, her authority crumbling faster than a gingerbread house in a hurricane. But the best part? The HOA was powerless to stop it. Norman was there to stay, a permanent reminder that sometimes the best way to fight the rules is to break them. With a 12-foot gnome. Karen, bless her controlling heart, wasn't about to go down without a fight. She called an emergency HOA meeting, her voice crackling with indignation over the phone. "This is an outrage," she shrieked. "A 12-foot gnome? It's a monstrosity! It's un-American." Okay, maybe she didn't say that last part, but you get the idea. The meeting was packed. Neighbors, intrigued by the drama, filled the room, their whispers and murmurs creating a buzz of anticipation. Karen, perched at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, glared at the assembled crowd. "This," she declared, her voice trembling with barely contained fury, "cannot stand. We must take action against this gnome invasion." She proposed a new rule, a draconian measure that would ban all oversized lawn ornaments. The room fell silent. Everyone knew this was aimed squarely at Norman, my beloved giant gnome. But I wasn't about to let Karen win. I stood up, and let me tell you, I was a sight to behold. Remember that gnome costume I mentioned? Yeah, I was wearing it. Full gnome regalia, complete with a pointy red hat, a fake beard, and a pair of oversized shoes that made me feel like I was walking on stilts. The room erupted in laughter. Even Mr. Henderson, the timid HOA president, couldn't help but crack a smile. Karen, however, was not amused. "This is a serious matter," she shrieked, her face turning an even deeper shade of purple. "This is not a laughing matter." But the laughter continued. The neighbors, inspired by my gnome-tastic defiance, had finally found their voice. "Oh, lighten up, Karen!" Mrs. Higgins called out. "It's just a gnome." "Yeah," another neighbor chimed in. "It's not like he's hurting anyone." "Besides," Mr. Johnson added, "it's way better than that creepy clown statue you have in your garden, Karen." The room erupted in laughter again. Karen's shoulders slumped. She looked around the room, her gaze meeting the amused faces of her neighbors, and realized she had lost. The HOA, once a symbol of oppressive conformity, had been defeated by a giant gnome and a community's newfound sense of humor. The vote was unanimous. Karen's proposed rule was rejected, and the HOA was forced to amend its regulations to allow reasonable decorative figures in all yards. It was a victory for individuality, a triumph for gnome kind, and a crushing defeat for Karen and her reign of terror. Karen, humiliated and defeated, resigned from the HOA in a huff. She packed her bags, her perfectly coordinated luggage matching her perfectly manicured nails, and left the neighborhood in a cloud of frustrated sighs and the faint scent of lavender potpourri. The HOA, now leaderless and demoralized, decided to take a more relaxed approach to community management. They stopped nitpicking about minor infractions, they allowed a wider range of paint colors, and they even organized a neighborhood potluck, though they did insist on pre-approving the menu to avoid any culinary disruptions. And my gnome? He stood tall, a symbol of defiance against the HOA's tyranny, and a reminder that sometimes the best way to fight the rules is to break them, with a 12-foot gnome. With Karen gone and the HOA in retreat, I decided to push my luck just a little further. After all, what's a 12-foot gnome without a friend? I contacted my gnome guy again, the one with the bewildered laugh. "Remember that 12-foot gnome?" I asked. "How could I forget?" He chuckled. "That thing was epic." "Well," I said, "get ready for round 2. This time I want 15 feet. and I want it holding a sign that says, "Long live the lawn gnomes." He didn't even question my sanity this time. He just laughed and said, "You're on, buddy. When do you want it delivered?" A few weeks later, a crane arrived, carrying my new gnome, Normageddon. He was even more magnificent than Norman, his smug grin wider, his hat taller, his sign a beacon of gnome-tastic defiance. I placed him beside Norman, creating a gnome duo that could be seen from space, probably. The HOA, bless their bureaucratic hearts, didn't even bother sending a violation notice. They had learned their lesson. They knew that any attempt to control my lawn ornaments would only result in a bigger, more ridiculous gnome. They had surrendered, defeated by my unwavering commitment to gnome-tastic absurdity. And so the gnomes stood tall, a symbol of resistance against HOA tyranny and a testament to the power of creative defiance. They became a beloved landmark, a tourist attraction, and a source of endless amusement for the neighborhood. Kids would play tag around their giant boots, couples would propose under their watchful eyes, and even the occasional dog walker would stop to pay their respects. The gnomes had won. The HOA had lost. And the neighborhood, once a sterile landscape of conformity, had blossomed into a haven of individuality and gnome-tastic glory. And as I sat on my porch, sipping lemonade and watching the sunset over my gnome-infested lawn, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes, the best way to fight the rules is to break them. With a 15-foot gnome.